Hello, BookTube. Mark at Book Time with Elvis and I are reading you a book. We are reading you The Warden by Anthony Trollope. He's doing the odd number chapters, I'm doing the even number chapters, and we are up to chapter 14, which is titled Mount Olympus. And in this, as in all cases, I'm going to try to keep my Steve annotations to a minimum. So this is chapter 14 of The Warden. Wretched in spirit, groaning under the feeling of insult, self-condemning and ill-satisfied in every way, Bold, that is John Bold, returned to his London lodgings. Ill as he had fared in his interview with the Archdeacon, he was not the less under the necessity of carrying out his pledge to Eleanor, and he went about his ungracious task with a heavy heart. He has to withdraw himself from the legal proceedings that he has started because he has declared his love for Eleanor, so he cannot be involved in a legal proceeding or an uproar to ruin her father. The attorneys whom he had employed in London received his instructions with surprise and evident misgiving. However, they could only obey, and mutter something of their sorrow that such heavy costs should only fall on their own employer, especially as nothing was wanting but perseverance to throw them on the opposite party. Bold left the office which he had latterly so much frequented, shaking the dust off his feet, and before he was down the stairs, an edict had already gone forth for the preparation of the bill. He next thought about the newspapers. The case had been taken up by more than one, and he was well aware that the keynote had been sounded by the Jupiter. He had been very intimate with Tom Towers, an editor at the Jupiter, and had often discussed with him the affairs of the hospital. Bold could not say that the articles in that paper had been written at his own instigation. He did not even know, as a fact, that they had been written by his friend. Tom Towers had never said that such a view of the case or such a side dispute would be taken by the paper with which he was connected. Very discreet in such matters was Tom Towers, and altogether indisposed to talk loosely of the concerns of that mighty engine of which it was his high privilege to move in secret some portion. He's a newspaper man. He writes for the Jupiter, and he's been partial to John Bold's side of the story. Nevertheless, Bold believed that to him were owing those dreadful words which had caused him such a panic at Barchester, and he conceived himself bound to prevent their repetition. With this view, he betook himself from the attorneys to that laboratory where, with amazing chemistry, Tom Towers compounded thunderbolts for the destruction of all that is evil and for the furtherance of all that is good in this and other hemispheres. Who has not heard of Mount Olympus, that high abode of all the powers of type, that favored seat of the goddess Pica? There's no goddess Pica. That is a reference to a kind of typeface, type font for newspapers. You don't need to worry about it. That wondrous habitation of gods and devils, from whence, with ceaseless hum of steam and never-ending flow of Castalian ink, issue forth 50,000 nightly edicts for the governance of a subject nation. This is Trollope being high-handed about a newspaper. What he's talking about is a big newspaper with printing presses and barrels of ink, writing stories. He's mocking them as being Olympian because he and his readers know they are often in the gutter. They are not godlike. It's a thin, joking conceit, and is unfortunately often true in Trollope. When he gets a thin, joking conceit, he works it into the ground. I guess it gets the pages written. Velvet and gilding do not make a throne, nor gold and jewels a scepter. It is a throne because the most exalted one sits there, and a scepter because the most mighty one wields it. So it is with Mount Olympus. Should a stranger make his way thither at dull noonday or during the sleepy hours of the silent afternoon, he would find no acknowledged temple of power and beauty, no fitting fane for the great thunderer, no proud facades and pillared roofs to support the dignity of this greatest of earthly potentates. No one thinks this way. No one does. But he's going to keep working it. To the outward and uninitiated eye, Mount Olympus is a somewhat humble spot, undistinguished, unadorned, nay, almost mean. It stands alone, as it were, in a mighty city, close to the densest throng of men, but partaking neither of the noise of the crowd, a small, secluded, dreary spot, tenanted, one would say, by quite unambitious people at the easiest rents. Is this Mount Olympus? Asks an unbelieving stranger. Is it from these small, dark, dingy buildings that those infallible laws proceed which cabinets are called upon to obey, by which bishops are to be guided, lords and commons controlled, judges instructed in law, generals in strategy, admirals in naval tactics, and orange women in the management of their barrows? Yes, my friend, from these walls. From here issue the only known infallible bulls for the guidance of British souls and bodies. This little court is the Vatican of England. Here reigns a pope, self-nominated, self-consecrated, aye, and much stranger too, self-believing. A pope whom, if you cannot believe him, I would advise you to disobey as silently as possible. A pope hitherto afraid of no Luther. A pope who manages his own inquisition, who punishes unbelievers as no most skillful inquisitor of Spain ever dreamed of doing. One who can excommunicate thoroughly, fearfully, radically, put you beyond the pale of men's charity, make you odious to your dearest friends, and turn you into a monster to be pointed at by the finger. Oh heavens, and this Mount Olympus. It is a fact amazing to ordinary mortals, oh my God. Okay, let's just keep going. It is a fact amazing to ordinary mortals that the Jupiter is never wrong. With what endless care, with what unsparing labor do we not strive to get together for our great national council the men most fitting to compose it? And how we fail. Parliament is always wrong. Look at the Jupiter and see how futile are their meetings, how vain their counsel, how needless all their trouble. With what pride do we regard our chief ministers, the great servants of state, the oligarchs of the nation on whose wisdom we lean, to whom we look for guidance in our difficulties. But what are they to the writers of the Jupiter? They hold counsel together with anxious thought, painfully elaborate their country's good. But when all is done, the Jupiter declares that all is not. Why should we look to Lord John Russell? Why should we regard Palmerston or Gladstone? These are politicians of Trollope's day. When Tom Towers, without a struggle, can put us right. Look at our generals, what faults they make, at our admirals, and how inactive they are. What money, honesty, and science can do is done, yet how badly are our troops brought together, fed, conveyed, clothed, armed, and managed. The most excellent of our good men do their best to man our ships, with the assistance of all possible external appliances, but in vain. All is wrong. Alas, alas, Tom Towers, and he alone, knows all about it. Why, oh why, ye earthly ministers, why have ye not followed more closely this heaven-sent messenger that is among us? Were it not well for us in our ignorance that we confided all things to the Jupiter? No one thinks this way, and no one thought this way in Trollope's day. Not one person thought that the Times of London was this infallible guide to all things, and the Times of London didn't think it. Okay, were it not well for us in our ignorance that we confided all things to the Jupiter, would it not be wise in us to abandon useless talking, idle thinking, and profitless labor? Away with majorities in the House of Commons, with verdicts from judicial bench given after much delay, with doubtful laws and the fallible attempts of humanity. Does not the Jupiter, coming forth daily with 50,000 impressions, full of unerring decision on every mortal subject, set all matters sufficiently at rest? Is not Tom Towers here able to guide us, and willing? Yes, indeed, able and willing to guide all men in all things, so long as he is obeyed as autocrat should be obeyed, with an undoubting submission. Only let not ungrateful ministers seek other colleagues than those whom Tom Towers may approve. Let church and state, law and physics, commerce and agriculture, the arts of war and the arts of peace, all listen and obey, and all will be made perfect. Has not Tom Towers an all-seeing eye? From diggings of Australia to those of California, right around the habitable globe, does he not know, watch, and chronicle the doings of everyone? From a bishopric in New Zealand to an unfortunate director of a Northwest Passage, is he not the only fit judge of capability? From the sewers of London to the Central Railway of India, from the palaces of St. Petersburg to the cabins of Connaught, nothing could escape him. Britons have but to read, to obey, and to be blessed. None but the fools doubt the wisdom of the Jupiter, none but the mad dispute its facts. No one thought this. This is Trollope just railing because he's got a bee in his bonnet, because he's got a very thin fictional conceit, and he is trying to tightrope walk a whole herd of elephants over it. It goes on. This is the title called Mount Olympus. No established religion has ever been without its unbelievers, even in a country where it is the most firmly fixed. No creed has been without scoffers. No church has so prospered as to free itself entirely from dissent. There are those who doubt the Jupiter. They live and breathe the upper air, walking here unscathed, though scorned. Men, born of British mothers and nursed on English milk, who scruple not to say that Mount Olympus has its price, that Tom Towers can be bought for gold. Such is Mount Olympus, the mouthpiece of all the wisdom of this great country. It may probably be said that no place in the 19th century is more worthy of notice. No treasury mandate armed with the signatures of all the government has half the power of one of those broadsheets which fly forth from hence so abundantly, armed with no signature at all. Some great man, some mighty peer, we'll say a noble duke, retires to rest, feared and honored by all his countrymen, fearless himself. If not a good man, at any rate a mighty man, too mighty to care much what men may say about his want of virtue. He rises in the morning degraded, mean, and miserable, an object of men's scorn, anxious only to retire as quickly as may be to some German obscurity, some obscene Italian privacy, or indeed anywhere out of sight. What has made this awful change? What has so afflicted him? An article that appeared in the Jupiter. Some 50 lines of narrow column have destroyed all his grace's equanimity and banished him forever from the world. No man knows who wrote the bitter words. The clubs talk confusedly on the matter, whispering to each other this and that name, while Tom Towers walks quietly among Pall Mall with his coat buttoned close against the east wind as though he were a mortal man and not a god dispensing thunderbolts from Mount Olympus. All of the politicians that Trollope has mentioned by name were regularly vituperated in the press. Didn't hurt them at all. Didn't hurt them at all. Didn't retire to Italy. He knows this is wrong. None of this is true. The men who wrote those editorials didn't consider themselves gods. No one took the Times of London's word as law from Mount Olympus. It certainly didn't carry as much weight as writs from the bench or the police. Anyway, let's just go on. It was not to Mount Olympus that our friend Bold, who's he again? It's been 2,000 words. It was not to Mount Olympus that our friend Bold betook himself. He had before now wandered round that lonely spot, thinking how grand a thing it was to write articles for the Jupiter, considering within himself whether, by any stretch of the powers within him, he could ever come to such distinction, wondering how Tom Towers would take any little humble offerings of his talent, calculating that Tom Towers himself must once have had a beginning, have once doubted his own success. Towers could not have been born a writer in the Jupiter. With such ideas, half ambitious and half awestruck, had Bold regarded the silent-looking workshop of the gods, but he had never yet by word or sign attempted to influence the slightest word of his unerring friend. On such a course was he now intent, and not without much inward palpitation did he betake himself to the quiet abode of wisdom, where Tom Towers was to be found o' mornings, inhaling ambrosia and sipping nectar in the shape of toast and tea. I don't know if you noticed this. If you compare this with the last chapter that I read or the chapter that Mark just read, notice that this is also poorly done. It's poorly written. It's gassy. It's not a good register for Trollope. He doesn't do it well. Let's continue. Not far removed from Mount Olympus, but somewhat nearer to the blessed regions of the West, is the most favored abode of Themis. It's a classical Greek mythology illusion. Ignore it. Washed by the rich tide which now passes from the towers of Caesar to Barry's halls of eloquence, and again back with new offerings of a city's tribute, from the palaces of peers to the mart of merchants, stand those quiet walls which law has delighted to honor by its presence. What a world within a world is the temple! How quiet are its entangled walks, as someone lately has called them, and yet how close to the densest concourse of humanity! How gravely respectable its sober alleys, though removed by but a single step from the profanity of the Strand and the low iniquity of Fleet Street. Old St. Dunstan, with its bell-smiting bludgeoners, had been removed, and the ancient shops wore their faces full of pleasant history, are passing away one by one. The bar itself is to go. Its doom has been pronounced by the Jupiter. Rumors tell us of some huge building that is to appear in these latitudes dedicated to law, subversive of the courts of Westminster, and antagonistic to the Rolls and Lincoln's Inn. But nothing yet threatens the silent beauty of the temple. It is the medieval court of the metropolis. That's a whole paragraph about modern construction. uh, in Trollope's day that he walked past and said, well, I should put that in my book. You don't have to pay attention to it at all. None of this matters. We got one mention there in a million words of John Bold, who is in London to talk to Tom Towers and his lawyers. But let's continue. Here, on the choicest spot of this ground, stands a lofty row of chambers looking obliquely upon the sullied Thames. Before the windows, the lawn of the Temple Gardens stretches with that dim yet delicious verdure so refreshing to the eyes of Londoners. It is, if doomed to live within the thickest of London smoke, you would surely say that that would be your chosen spot. Yet you whom I now address, my dear middle-aged bachelor friend, it's the ladies who are reading you, and you know it as well as they do, can now be so well domiciled as here. No one here will ask whether you are out or at home, alone or with friends. Here, no Sabbatarian will investigate your Sundays. No censorious landlady will scrutinize your empty bottle. No valetudinarian neighbor will complain of late hours. If you love books, to what place are books so suitable? The whole spot is redolent of typography. Would you worship the Paphian goddess? The groves of cypress are not more taciturn than those of the temple. Wit and wine are always here, and always together. The revels of the temple are as those of the polished Greece, where the wildest worshipper of Bacchus never forgot the dignity of the god whom he adored. Where can retirement be so complete as here? Where can you be so sure of all the pleasures of society? It was here that Tom Towers lived and cultivated with eminent success the 10th muse who now governs the periodical press. There are 9 muses in Greek mythology. Trollope is alluding to a 10th one that involves the press, because he's elevated the press to Mount Olympus. No one in the press thought that way about themselves. No one in the country thought that way about the press. But it is let it not be supposed that his chambers were such, or so comfortless, as frequently the gaunt abodes of legal aspirants. 4 chairs, a half-filled deal of bookcase with hangings of dingy green baize, an old office table covered with dusty papers, which are not moved once in 6 months, and an older Pembroke brother with rickety legs, all for daily uses. That was a Pembroke brother. It's not a person. It's a kind of table with leaves as you can snap up into place to make it even longer. It's a purely topical reference. A dispatcher for the preparation of lobsters and coffee, and an apparatus for the cooking of toast and mutton chops. Such utensils and luxuries as these do not suffice for the well-being of Tom Towers. He indulged in 4 rooms on the first floor, each of which was furnished, if not with splendor, with probably more than the comfort of Stafford House. Again, you don't have to worry about it. It's a gigantic and famously opulent house in London. Every addition that science and art could have lately made to the luxuries of modern life was to be found here. The room in which he usually sat was surrounded by bookshelves carefully filled, nor was there a volume there which was not entitled to its place in such a collection, both by its intrinsic worth and exterior splendor. A pretty portable set of steps in one corner of the room showed that those even on the higher shelves were intended for use. The chamber contained but 2 works of art. The one, an admirable bust of Sir Robert Peel by Power, declared the individual politics of our friend, and the other, a singularly long figure of a female devotee by Millet, told equally plainly the school of art to which he was addicted. This picture was not hung, as pictures usually are, against the wall. There was no inch of wall vacant for such a purpose. It had a stand or desk erected for its own accommodation, and there on her pedestal, framed and glazed, stood the devotional lady looking intently at a lily as no lady ever looked before. Our modern artists, whom we style pre-Raphaelites, this is when pre-Raphaelites were modern artists, have delighted to go back not only to the finish and peculiar manner, but also to the subjects of earlier painters. It is impossible to give them too much praise for the elaborate perseverance with which they have equaled the minute perfections of the masters from whom they take their inspiration. Nothing, probably, can exceed the painting of some of these latter-day pictures. It is, however, singular into what faults they fall as regards their subject. They are not quite content to take the old stock groups, a Sebastian with his arrows, a Lucia with her eyes in a dish, a Lorenzo with a gridiron, or the Virgin and 2 children, but they are anything but happy with their change. As a rule, no figure should be drawn in a position which is which it is impossible to suppose any figure should maintain. This is a 300-word paragraph about the Pre-Raphaelites and their idiosyncrasies as painters. And it's not done. The patient endurance of St. Sebastian, the wild ecstasy of St. John in the wilderness, the maternal love of the Virgin, all are feelings naturally portrayed by a fixed posture. But the lady with the stiff back and bent neck, who looks at her flower and is still looking from hour to hour, gives us an idea of pain without grace and abstraction without a cause. What does that have to do with Tom Towers, who bought it for 6 pence because he liked the look of it? Nothing. What does it have to do with John Bold, who won't even notice it when he enters the room? Nothing. What does it have to do with the broader plot? Nothing. Anyway, it is easy from his rooms to see that Tom Towers was a sybarite, a pleasure lover, let's say, though by no means an idle one. He was lingering over his last cup of tea, surrounded by an ocean of newspapers through which he had been swimming, when John Bold's card was brought in by his tiger. Odd phrase. You expect Trollope would know that that was going to outdate basically the kind of servant who would give you the card of a visitor. They had, most of them had a kind of a striped outfit, hence the name, but anyway. This tiger never knew that his master was at home, though he often knew that he was not, and thus Tom Towers was never invaded but by his own consent. On this occasion, after twisting the card twice in his fingers, he signified to his attendant imp that he was visible, and the inner door was unbolted, and our friend announced. I have before said that he was of the Jupiter, and John Bold, that he of the Jupiter and John Bold were intimate. There was no very great difference in their ages, for Towers was still considerably under 40, and when Bold had been attending the London hospitals, Tower, who was not then the great man he has since become, had been much with him. Then they had often discussed together the objects of their ambition and their future prospects. Then Tom Towers was struggling hard to maintain himself as a briefless barrister, by shorthand reporting for any of the papers that would engage him. Then he had not yet dared to dream of writing leaders for the Jupiter, that is, front-page columns, or canvassing the conduct of cabinet ministers. Things had altered since that time. The briefless barrister was still briefless, but he now despised briefs. Could he have been sure of a judge's seat, he would hardly have left his present career. It is true he wore no ermine, bore no outward marks of the world's respect, but with what load of inward importance was he charged? It is true his name appeared in no large capitals, on no walls was chalked up Tom Towers forever, freedom of the press, and Tom Towers, but what member of Parliament had half his power? It is true that in far-off provinces men did not talk daily of Tom Towers, but they read the Jupiter, and acknowledged that without the Jupiter life was not worth having. No one ever acknowledged that. No one ever said that. This kind of hidden but still conscious glory suited the nature of the man. He loved to sit silent in a corner of his club and listen to the loud chattering of politicians, and to think how they were all in his power, how he could smite the loudest of them, were it worth his while to raise his pen for such a purpose. He loved to watch the great men of whom he daily wrote, and flatter himself that he was greater than any of them. Each of them was responsible to his country. Each of them must answer if inquired into. Each of them must endure abuse with good humor and insolence without anger. But to whom was he, Tom Towers, responsible? No one could insult him. No one could inquire into him. He could speak out withering words, and no one could answer him. Ministers courted him, though perhaps they knew not his name. Bishops feared him. Judges doubted their own verdicts unless he confirmed them, and generals in their councils of war did not consider more deeply what the enemy would do than what the Jupiter would say. Tom Towers never boasted of the Jupiter. He scarcely ever named the paper even to the most intimate of his friends. He did not even wish to be spoken of as connected with it, but he did not the less value his privileges, or think the less of his own importance. It is probable that Tom Towers considered himself the most powerful man in Europe, and so he walked on from day to day, studiously striving to look at a man, but knowing within his breast that he was a god. And that is Mount Olympus. That is the whole of chapter 12 of this book. Completely useless pedagogy. That's all it is, just Trollope writing words. That's all it is. The words don't have any meaning. You'll notice there was no dialogue. There were no inner thoughts of any characters. There was no scene setting except for Tom Towers' rooms in the Inns of Court. Who cares what his rooms look like? Who cares? Instead, the whole of the chapter is giving over to this one conceit that isn't it amazing that we have this all-powerful diviner of all matters of wisdom, politics, law, the military, how apple cart women run their carts. Isn't it amazing that we have this one trumpet of truth and that the people who run it are gods and that everyone in the world fears them and waits on their every word? None of that is true. None of it was true when Trollope wrote it. It's all just hammy Dickensian-style satire. And it doesn't work at all. It doesn't work at all. So my luck, just by random chance, my luck for this time around in our read-along was a filler chapter, a pure filler chapter. I read chapter 10 to you, where John Bold goes to talk with Archdeacon Grantley about how he's withdrawing his suit. He intends to tell Archdeacon Grantley the reason why, which is that he intends to plight his troth, he intends to become the husband of Eleanor Harding, who is the daughter of the brother of the Archdeacon's wife. So they will be brothers. He's intended to go there telling him not only that he was withdrawing his case, but why. Archdeacon Grantley is so venomous to him, so smug and gloating, that his temper gets the best of him, and he leaves before he announces anything. Otherwise, he would have struck the Archdeacon. He rushes back to London, where he has an unpleasant task in front of him, which is to officially tell everybody involved, not only his lawyers, but the papers, especially Tom Towers and the Jupiter, that he's withdrawing his interest in this whole thing. He has a reason that he wants to let this story drop. Then we have a chapter, and then we have another chapter, this chapter, where John Bold is in London. Does he get to tell that to Tom Towers? No. Do we learn any of the after effects of him telling that? No. Do we learn anything that's on his mind? No, we don't. Instead, we learn that Tom Towers has a whole bunch of books in his private apartment. It's okay. All right, great. So that's chapter 12. If I were, I would never suggest the heresy of making an abridged version of the Warden. It's short enough as it is. But if I were, I would cut this chapter completely. Trollope, obviously, like I mentioned, we've mentioned a few times before that these things were written in installments for the periodical press before they then came out as books. This was obviously written to make word count and fill out a number. It's a completely filler chapter. It tells you nothing. It would tell you one thing, maybe, if the acidic conceit of the overestimation of the power of the London Times in the chapter, which is the whole chapter, it's the only thing the chapter does, it might not be a filler chapter if that conceit had any grounding in reality, but it doesn't. So you reading along here should hope for better in Mark's chapter, where maybe something will actually happen. That would be great. Just a rare instance where Trollope just has no ear for the balance of a chapter and no eye for whether or not it is a weak spot in the eventual book. So that's our read along for today. We'll have better luck next time, I'm sure. Thank you, BookTube.